We're sitting here with Jeff Rubin. What interests me in talking to you, Jeff, is that it's refreshing to see an economist talk about peak oil. You were the chief economist with CIBC, one of the largest banks in Canada. And so the first question is that, when did you become a believer in peak oil?
I guess I became a believer in peak oil when I first read a book by Colin Campbell called The Coming Oil Crisis, and then went to see him, maybe about 8 to 10 years ago. And of course it ran counter to all of my instincts as an economist, because in economics there's really very little role for depletion. I mean, it's all about prices. Higher prices bring forth new supply, and the very notion of finite limits to consumption is something that, you know, isn't something that most economists have warm and fuzzy feelings towards.
Right. So what year was this? 10 years ago?
This would be roughly 2000. I went to see Colin Campbell in a tiny little hamlet outside of Cork, Ireland called Ballydehub, and he provided a pretty compelling case, and I view myself as a pretty hard-nosed macroeconomist, and he was able to convince me. I mean, again, I don't think it's a question of the world ever running out of oil in some absolute geological sense. It's real. Depletion is really an economic concept. The world's running out of the oil that we can afford to burn. It doesn't matter that there's 170 billion barrels of oil in the Athabasca tar sands or 500 billion barrels in the Orinoco heavy oil belt in Venezuela, if the price of extracting that oil is a price that we can't afford to pay. So really depletion, at least from my perspective, is more an economic concept than just a geological concept.
Okay, so in your book, you say why your world is about to get a whole lot smaller.
That's right. Why? What is that?
What is that?
What is that all about?
What does that have to do with peak oil? And so what do you mean? Now, an average person is watching this thing. The terminologies could be heavy. You know, the peak oil, decline, all that. It doesn't mean a whole lot to them.
Right. So let's just put it in.
Put it in layman's terms. What is happening?
Okay. Distance costs money.
Okay.
In a world of triple-digit oil prices, the whole model of a global economy, where we produce something at one end of the world to be sold at another end of the world, presumably to take advantage of cheap labor, doesn't make a whole lot of economic sense, because in so many cases, from steel to food, it's penny wise, pound foolish, as the Brits would say. In other words, what you save on wage costs by having some cheap labor force in China or India manufacturing the good or growing your food, you more than squander in bunker fuel moving that food to your market. So instead of the model of a global economy where you're very specialized, trying to find a very specialized niche in a vast global market, we're going to go back. We're going to go back to more of a local, regional economy, because that's going to make a whole lot more economic sense in a world where oil costs $120 a barrel than where oil used to cost $20 a barrel.
It's very interesting. I do a lot of interviews with a lot of scientists, but it's probably one of the rare times when I'm sitting down with an economist that really comes to terms with what we call the peak oil, as you have. Because when an economist talks, from many people's perspective, they respect that view. You're a banker.
Well, I don't know whether they should. Given what's happened to banks, I don't know if they should. But
a lot of this skepticism comes from the Wall Street and the banks,
right.
And they just say, look at this GDP formula.
Right.
And by the way, let's look at the GDP formula. In this whole formula, there is no place for depletion of resources. No. Which is like you said, is kind of the engine of our economy.
That's right.
Now, what you just said was very important to me. Many people will just say, okay, peak oil is coming. 70s came here. All right, so what? I am paying $3 per gallon, so I'll pay $4, $5 per gallon. I'm not going to sweat over it. But you're talking about a macroeconomy that changes. You're talking about reverse globalization.
That's right.
You're talking about an impact. So what is the future look like? 5 years out, Tell me, if you're driving a car, what happens? If you're buying grocery, what happens? Give us a picture of that. And by the way, we're talking to Jeff Rubin, why your world is about to get a whole lot smaller.
Well, what my book is really about is how is the world economy going to grow, continue to grow with triple-digit oil prices? Because every time we've seen an oil shock, 73, 79, 91, the recent one, we've had huge recessions.
Right.
So is peak oil going to mean peak GDP? I mean, that's a very bearish scenario because that's not just a recession. That's a permanent recession. And I'm saying, peak oil doesn't have to be apocalyptic. I mean, it will be apocalyptic if we want to get our frozen chicken wings from China and drive our SUVs 60, 70 miles back and forth to work. In other words, it will be if we insist on consuming as much oil as it was when it was cheap and abundant. But what I'm saying is, I'm an economist. I believe in prices. I believe people will respond to prices. And what I'm saying is a rational economic response to triple-digit oil prices is to change the nature of our economy. That won't prevent oil from getting back to triple-digit levels, but what it will do is allow the economy to grow with that. Meaning we have to start using a whole lot less oil. So it means we've got to start making our own stuff instead of getting it halfway around the world, because it burns too much oil to get goods halfway around the world. We're probably going to be driving different vehicles. We're certainly going to be driving less. Already last year there were 4 million fewer cars on the road in the United States. I think there's probably going to be 30, 40 million fewer cars in the next 10 years. We've got to invest in public transit so that when 40 million Americans take the exit lane, there's a bus to get on. And I think we're going to find a few silver linings in this transition. We're going to find that industries that we thought were gone forever, like the steel industry, is going to come back. I mean, who would dream that triple-digit oil prices could breathe new life into our hollowed-out Rust Belt? But that's what the transport costs from triple-digit oil prices will do. A lot of the farmland that has now become suburban sprawl, it's amazing how green triple-digit oil prices can be, because in a world where we no longer import $6 billion worth of food from China every year, we're going to have to grow our own food. Only so much of our agricultural land has already been paved over. Triple-digit oil prices will revert that back to its agricultural use. So that, in many ways, I think while there will obviously be challenges and costs, in many ways we may find this new local economy a lot more sustainable and livable than the big oily global economy we've all taken for granted.
As an economist, where do you see the price of oil go, let's say, within 5 years, within 10 years?
Well, let me say, so why 5, 10 years? Why not just say, where do you think it's going in the next 5 months?
Let's say next 5 months.
I think we're going right back in a triple-digit range. I mean, here we are, and West Texas Intermediate, which is the benchmark North American oil price, is already over $80, when most of the major oil-consuming economies of the world haven't even got back to the level of GDP they were before the recession began. Only Germany and Canada of the G7 are back there. And where's oil trading? At $80. I mean, turn the clock back 3 years ago, and that would have been a world all-time record high. Now it's where most of the oil-consuming economies still haven't recovered. I think we're going to see triple-digit oil prices. The question is our economy any better to withstand those triple-digit oil prices than it was in 2008? Because if it isn't, oil prices can go back down to $40. Not because oil's cheap and abundant, only because we couldn't afford not to be in a recession.
Okay. So, if one reads your book, what do they learn in terms of things they can do to prepare for an era where no longer we have cheap oil, where there is what you call a reverse globalization, things going to be localized? What are the things they can do today to prepare for themselves and not get caught off guard?
Okay, I mean, let's take real estate, for example, okay? In a world of triple-digit oil prices, suburban sprawl doesn't make any sense anymore. Okay, that was all predicated on...
If you're building a house in about 20 miles out of town, large one.
Bad move.
Stop it.
Bad move. What you're going to see, if suburban sprawl was the corollary of cheap oil, rising urban density is the corollary of triple-digit oil prices. So you may want to buy some property in some inner city, even if it's a slum right now, because that's going to get redeveloped in a hurry with triple-digit oil prices. You may want to sell your palace in the far-flung exurbs, because all of a sudden you're going to find that when people can't afford to commute 50, 60 miles every day back and forth to work, the value of that land's going to fall. So much so that when food prices rise because we're not getting our food from the rest of the world, that may become farmland.
Yeah, exactly.
In terms of investments, I mean, we may find that industries, as I say, that we've written off and thought they're gone forever, like steel, for example, are going to make an amazing comeback.
Railroad, perhaps.
Or rail, certainly.
Yeah.
Now, on industries to avoid. Cars. And why did we spend $40 billion bailing out General Motors? Why didn't we spend that money in investing in public transit so that when millions of Americans do ditch their cars, there's public transport to get on? We probably don't want to invest in airlines. Not that people won't fly, but flying is going to become very expensive, and probably, the costs of flying is going to go back to what it was in the 60s and 70s. I don't think there's an airline in the world that can make money at today's oil prices, let alone the oil prices that I'm suggesting is right around the corner. But for every cost, for every industry that is hurt by triple-digit oil prices, I think investors will see other opportunities, the flip side of that, as is always the case.
Jeff, when we look at the consumer society, let's say the Europeans, all right, and Americans, it seems that there has been a shift in approach to how to look at the new era of economy. Specifically, the G20 meeting that happened in Canada, it appeared that there's a drift. The Europeans are more toward accepting the reality there's going to be a low growth era. Now, they're not talking about peak oil, but I think partially when you look at underlying logic, they're paying attention that energy is going to play a huge role, and energy is not going to be cheap. And they're going through austerity plans. They're apparently, preparing themselves, at least talking about it.
Right.
Where in the United States, we are, for the most part, we have one group in the office.
Foot on the gas pedal.
Foot on the gas. It says, look, step aside. You don't know how to drive this. Let me come over there. Without acknowledging that the engine has to be refurbished, if you will.
Absolutely.
So if once this crisis or opportunities come, how's Europe going to survive? It appears that they are much more prepared than we are.
Europe's going to do better for the simple reason that they've accepted that in a world of triple-digit oil prices, the economy's speed limit changes. And that's most relevant for the largest oil-consuming economy in the world, which isn't Europe, it's the United States. The problem with Obama is he can't get cheap oil. And fiscal stimulus or zero interest rates is not a substitute for cheap oil. I mean, here we are running a huge $1.5 trillion deficit, 10% of GDP, but the economy's still going nowhere because that's not a substitute for triple-digit oil prices. It's not going to make the economy grow faster. It's just going to make the budget deficit bigger and a bigger break on economic growth when we have to start paying this budget deficit down, which will be pretty soon.
All right, we're talking to Jeff Rubin. The book is Why Your World is About to Get a Whole Lot Smaller. A good read for those that want to see what's going to happen tomorrow and want to see how our new economy is taking shape right before our eyes. This book is highly recommended. Jeff, thank you.
My pleasure, Bruce. Take care.
All right, thanks.